dive in to understanding the radical left. And that includes understanding what's happening with these protest movements and some of their significance. And who better to talk about this with than somebody who himself, especially during the tumultuous 1960s, was a Marxist radical who was so far to the left that he and his comrades bolted from the Communist Party because it wasn't radical enough. It was, as I like to say, too kino for him. That is, communist in name only. Retired psychotherapist, PhD psychologist, and also a Buddhist teacher and, as I said, former psychotherapist, Dr. Marv Treiger, now a conservative and a Trump fan, joins us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Marv, my friend, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. I appreciate you being along for the ride today, and I'm so excited about what we're going to dive into here on the program. I want to give you an opportunity first to tell us a little bit about your story, just sort of origin here. 1960s, you were a radical leftist involved in the movements of that era. How did you get roped up in far-left activism?
How did I get roped up? Well, I was in 1961. I was down in. I was working for $1.25 an hour, about 20 hours a week. Ended up in Washington Square Park. The Revolution had just taken place, and there was a lot of buzz and excitement about it. And people were talking. It was a free speech area. And there was a speaker, and he was up there talking about it. And I was listening, making total sense. And then somebody asked him about Hungary, and to what sounded to me at the time like Hungary. So he supported the Cuban Revolution, but he also supported the Soviet troops, the Hungarian. I thought, wow, what's going on? So as I'm standing there, I see a guy's coming up to the platform where he's speaking. Look good, and so I kind of walk over and I kind of get between them, and the guy spits at him, catches me in the face. The speaker invites me for coffee after. He and his African-American wife at their home on Amsterdam and 125th in Harlem. And for the next 10 weeks, I studied Marxism-Leninism and came out a commie.
Came out a commie. That is quite something. And I apologize. You were cutting in and out. We figured out, we know what's going on. You were cutting in and out for just snippets of that story, but we basically got it, Marv Treiger. We're working on fixing the connections on our end, I believe. But in terms of
I'm hearing it also from your end.
That's better now.
You're also.
I think we're better now.
The intro was not quite right.
Okay, so I think we're getting a little bit better now, so I apologize. Occasionally these technical glitches happen with the internet and so forth. So, Marv, what was it about Marxist-Leninism that really brought you into the fold, and not just into the fold ideologically, but also where you became very involved in movements like Students for a Democratic Society? You went and participated in a sit-in in solidarity with Selma and engaged in other activities. What was it that got you so motivated to become active?
Well, I would say that early on as a teenager, I became anti-fascist after studying the Holocaust. And then I noticed that the communists very often, when they're out of power, support causes where there's some injustice, and sometimes they're at the forefront, even though maybe secretly, but they're involved deeply. So they were involved in the civil rights movement. They were involved in anti-war movement. They were involved in these different things. Of course, for the communists, this was simply a stepping stone self. And when many years later, there was a reunion of the old comrades, and they invited me, even though I was way off doing something else. And at that meeting, I said to them in a circle at the end, I said, the greatest blessing of my life was that I was part of a movement that never came to power. So the communists can sometimes do good things when there's injustice, but they use it to come into power and then forget about.
So, Marv, what are a few of the activities that you had engaged in back in the 1960s? I mean, I know that you were at the meeting of the Students for Democratic Society major convention when what became later known as the Weather Underground, the Weathermen, broke off, and you ended up in a separate direction. So tell us a little bit about a few of the things that you were engaged in during that time of the tumultuous 60s.
Well, as a kind of concept or idea of participatory democracy and a new form of small d democracy, spread like wildfire on the campuses and ended up having tens and tens of thousands of members. And they had a convention in 68, which had about 3,000 attendees. But by 68, what had happened was Marxist factions had come to completely control all the different major groups within SDS. And so our group, which was the Radical Youth Movement, part of SDS, which was linked to Bernadine Dohrn and Bill Ayers and Michael Klonsky and Noel Ignatin, who was a originator of white privilege and all of that sort of thing. We decided that we had to break off from the old-fashioned communists, and so a big speech was given, and the convention was split absolutely in two with Bernadine Dohrn's speech. And I spent the last 45 minutes of her speech with her, helping her to tweak it. The next day, the rump of that convention formed a new convention, and that convention was going to be led by an executive committee of three. I was nominated for education secretary. We were the smaller group, but the people that eventually became weathermen decided to take everything. And so Bill Ayers became the educational secretary, and that group split. So from 3,000 members, it was down to about 300 and about 250. And let me tell you, that was the second blessing of my life, because had I been pulled into the whole weathermen thing, it would have been a whole different outcome.
That is such I don't know of anybody else, at least I don't know anybody else, who was defeated by Bill Ayers, of all people, in some kind of an election. In your case, it was to become education secretary of a radical leftist organization, which is really quite something. Once again, we are talking with Dr. Marv Treiger, now joining us via the telephone. Marv, can you hear me okay, my friend?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. So I want to take a step back and ask you for just a moment to kind of summarize everything you just told us.
Well, where did it leave off?
You know, what the thing that stuck in my mind from where we left off was where you were talking about the SDS convention and the splitting off from that group when you lost, after you lost your race for education secretary against none other than the infamous Bill Ayers, and after having helped Bernadine Dohrn write a very seminal speech for that convention.
Well, helped her tweak it, at any rate.
Sure.
She had it all written out. But yeah, okay. So that was a split. That split took place at the big SDS convention, and then the following day at our Rump convention, another split. And at that point, the group that was the majority morphed soon into the Weathermen. And so I was very happy to not have been part of that, because that would have been completely against my understanding, approach, and principles. So that to me was the second blessing of my life. After having confessed to my comrades at one point that the first blessing of my life was that I was never part of a movement that came to power. And that led me to the point that people come in and out of the left movement. You've probably met many here and there. They're all around, and they are no longer activists. They've rejected formal politics in that regard, but they still hold to the worldview. And that is the problem, that once it's in their brain, they tend to keep it the rest of their lives and never examine it and deconstruct it. And I believe that what you have to do is to take a roto-rooter to your brain and clear it out and clean it out, and make room for spirituality and for a deeper understanding of the nature of things, all of that stuff, and restudy America and its extraordinary history and the history of Western civilization.
Sure.
To substitute for the old worldview.
And I want to just ask one more question before we jump into the roto-rooter process. I mentioned in my introduction earlier that you and a bunch of comrades bolted from the Communist Party because it was too, as I like to say, kino for you, communist in name only. Why was the Communist Party not radical enough for a young Marv Treiger in the 1960s?
Well, ironically, from the standpoint of effectiveness in the movements of the day, they were right and I was wrong, or partially wrong. The Communist Party worked behind the scenes, so that, for example, they were already strongly influencing the Democratic Party in California, where I was working, and strongly influenced trade unions, even though they were at a low mark in their American history. After the Khrushchev revelations of Stalin from 1956, their membership was at its lowest, but they were still quite influential. So just to give you an example, there was a major demonstration in 1967 called the Century City Plaza demonstrations against Lyndon Baines Johnson and the war. And tens of thousands of people showed up for that demonstration. And there was a great umbrella organization, the Peace Action Council. Well, it was led by a communist. And then there was the Women's Strike for Peace. Well, that was led by a communist. And more than half of the different organizations under the umbrella were led by communists. However, the membership of all these organizations were ordinary people who were wanting to fight around some particular issue. Well, the end result of the Century City Plaza demonstrations, just to sum it up real quickly, is that it ended up in a violent confrontation between the police and the demonstrators, and that exposed, that turned the white middle class against the Vietnam War in Los Angeles and split the Democratic Party. Lyndon Baines Johnson was never able to go out again to any city in the country, and a few months later he decided not to run for office again. Well, the Communist Party succeeded on that day in changing national politics, but doing so more or less behind the scenes. Well, but to me, they weren't radical enough, and they weren't front enough and forward enough, and so I moved to the left, and the country was moving, the movement was moving to the left at that time, and so then the Black Panther Party, they were the big vanguard and holding up Mao's little book, and then the white radicals tended to see themselves as an auxiliary or sidecar to the black movement, which was starting to rise, and that movement was more radical, finally leading to the violence of Weatherman.
This is so interesting. We're going to come back to this because I'm hearing some resonance with what we're seeing right now with the current civil unrest and protests in there, Dr. Marv Treiger. But before we get to that, I want to ask you, you described a little bit about some of the things that need to happen for a roto-rooter process, as you describe it, in order to move from being a very far left individual like yourself on to ultimately embracing the tenets of freedom and the idea that we value so much here on this very program, that we should be free to think, free to act, and free to choose. In other words, you became a conservative. Tell us a little bit about that, and especially how also your Buddhist faith, and you're a Buddhist teacher, how that fits into this too.
Well, I think a key aspect of this is, remember, communism is based upon atheism, and that's also linked to secularism, and that's also linked to elevating science as the sole God, which is really scientism, not really science. So therefore, a connection to spirituality, to religion, in some fashion undermines the fundamental underpinnings of atheism. So for me, Buddhism did that. And it did it, like with sandpaper, gradually over a period of time, sort of undermining the foundations. So that was going on for, a couple of decades, and 3 decades, actually. But finally, what came to pass was I was in retreat in 2001. And 7 months that year I was in retreat, and 3 months in solitary retreat. And my wife said to me before I went into retreat, solitary, she said, "Honey, do you want to know what's going on in the world politically? Because I always like to follow it." And I said, "No, baby, unless it's on the level of Pearl Harbor." Well, sure enough, 9/11 happened. And so she sent me word. I'm a little isolated cabin in the Northwest, and I get this message, and it's delivered to me by hand. And all of a sudden, my mind was very clear, my heart was very open, and it was like I saw the future. I mean, not in a Nostradamus kind of way, but I saw it just because I knew some history and politics, and I was very open. And what I saw was that the radical left was going to form a de facto alliance with Islamism or with whatever force was against America, because that was the common enemy. And I knew that we were in for it. And I made a vow while in retreat that when I got out, I was going to re-examine and restudy all the foundations that made us the most extraordinary civilization that has yet been on Earth.
Was there any particular book or thinker that especially resonated with you after you got out of retreat, Dr. Marv Treiger, to help inspire this trajectory that led towards more of a conservative mindset?
Well, there were many, but I would say that the book that probably moved me and impressed me the most was by Thomas Sowell, the great African-American historian from Stanford and the Hoover Institute. Yeah. And, economist and sociologist and philosopher and political comment. I mean, he's an all-purpose guy. And volume 3 of his trilogy, entitled Conquest and Culture, really did it for me, because he introduced me to some fantastic, extraordinary history and geography, and economics, but also to the idea that every people has a psychic culture, and that it's very, very important that the elements of its elevation elevation must come from individuals who then spread it to other individuals within their own culture. And unless that happens, all the outside interest, compassion, help, welfare isn't going to cut it. It's not going to change it fundamentally. It has to, in the last analysis, come from inside the psychic culture. And Sowell then studied all kinds of different the psychic cultures of all these different peoples, and it's a work of genius, and I recommend it to your listeners.
Dr. Marv Treiger, again, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. One thing that I want to get to before we take a brief break and then jump into the protest movements and so forth, and get to what's happening today and how that can resonate with the 60s and what lessons we should learn. I want to get a basic understanding of the far left right now as to where you see things as being at, especially when you trace back to the Marxist ideologies that In a lot of ways, they seem to be espousing, but also the modern left seems to be a little bit separated from some of the traditional notions of coming together on a class basis. Now there seems to be some interesting racial elements that play into this a little bit more even than class to some extent. But I'm curious your thoughts on what we need to know overall about the radical left, and then also about the left today and anything that it might have changed.
Well, I would say that it's really important to understand identity politics and its origins. So what are its origins? Basically, it's a class war or class struggle. What was the original identity politics? It was Marxism and the working class, not each individual worker, not somebody who became a worker, who came down from the middle class or who went up to the middle class or who even became wealthy. No, it was the notion of a group defined by, in that case, an economic position in society. And so, therefore, justice became associated with justice for a group. And the truth of it is, there's no such thing as social justice. That should shock any leftists who have tuned in. There's only individual justice, because everything that is done either legally, illegally, fairly, unfairly, right or wrong is always done by an individual. He may gather with other individuals, and so those individuals do it, but he must be tried, he must be submitted to the bar of justice as an individual. You can't submit groups to the bar of justice. If you do, then you immediately create divisions and sectarianism in society. One of the reasons why the Soviet Union fell was they were continually making the case that only workers should be in position. This worker should be in position. If a person was a brilliant engineer, it didn't matter if he hadn't been from the working class. And so everything started to get reduced to a common theme. The second issue connected to identity politics is the fact that ideologically you agree with and advocate identity politics. In other words, and in the communist movement, the slogan that captured that was "better red than dead." So, in other words, they would promote people who had the right ideology. So the mix of the right political line with the right identity was what determined your advance in society. That can only be done by a central controlling operation. It ends up totalitarian, and it has nothing to do with justice.
So interesting, and it really goes down to this point too, since this is Free to Choose Friday, Marv, and that is individuals can choose and make choices about what they're going to do for actions. They may get grouped together with others, but they're still making that choice one way or another. And in a free society, the idea is that you should be free to choose whatever path you would like to take, as long as it doesn't violate the individual rights of other individuals. But the collectivist notion that you're describing, rooted in this sort of identity politics mindset, is, it seems to me, fundamentally about how no, individuals should not be free to choose. Instead, we should try to control it in order to achieve some mythical notion of social justice. Control the individuals instead of giving them freedom to choose, because we need to achieve this goal of social justice.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. Very well said. Friedrich Engels, who was Karl Marx's partner and collaborator, Friedrich Engels once said that freedom, this was his definition of freedom, freedom is the appreciation of necessity. So freedom is not actually, for Marxists, about choice. It's about appreciating necessity. Now, what does that mean? What is the necessity? Well, the necessity in question was the march of history toward a preordained goal, which was the goal of full and complete equality of all beings under communism. And so therefore, anything that advanced it was freedom. Anything that stood in the way of it was not freedom. Choice was not part of the equation.
And I think that one of the things that underscores this point is if you listen to the left right now, they say, well, freedom, you're not really free if you can't afford this service or that product. That's not freedom when you cannot afford those things. We should have the government provide it, and then you will be free. Whereas a conservative or a libertarian will say, no, freedom is when you as an individual have the choice to do something, the ability to think, act, and choose without having to go to the government for permission. And I think that idea gets at the core of what you're saying.
Yeah, I would put emphasis on the latter syllable, as the expression goes. The people who are going to decide who is free and who is going to get what they need, that group invariably holds power, and
right.
Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So therefore, they're going to always take care of themselves and their own before they'll take care of anyone else. And so the slogans, which are fine and beautiful, nevertheless are never implemented. So there never comes a time when, in fact, everyone is, in fact, made equal. And that problem goes back even before Karl Marx. It goes back to the philosophy of Rousseau. And it was the slogan for the French Revolution, which was also before Karl Marx. And that is this notion of an absolute equal outcome for every person. And until then, we can condemn all other differences from that endpoint as being oppressive, unjust, racist, classist, you name it. And this absolutely obliterates the uniqueness, distinction of every individual and of the human race, and of the fact that if you're parents and you have two children, by the time you get the second one, you know that two human beings are completely different from one another.
Goodness, isn't that true? Dr. Marv Treiger, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, former Marxist radical. Before we go to our break, I do want to play one clip. So Milton Friedman is our patron economist here on Free to Choose Fridays. And in cut 2, I want to play this one where Friedman is talking about socialism and a conversation he had with someone from Poland who was then back in Poland, had been arrested and what have you. But in a conversation with him, this guy was a socialist viewing it as an ideal, but not something that could work in the real world until something was achieved. And it resonates quite well with what you're telling us. So take a listen. This is Milton Friedman back around late 1970s, early 1980s, I think.
On this same trip that we took to Russia, we stopped in Poland, in Warsaw for a while, and we met there a marvelous man, a man by the name of Edward Lipinski, who was in this country a year ago at the age of 83 or 4. I believe was arrested when he got back to Poland because he had been one of those who had signed and authored a declaration against the suppression of freedom of thought and speech in Poland. But at the time we met Edward Lipinski, he seemed to be fairly free. He was a man who had been a socialist all his life. And this was really very hard he was now in his 70s, I may say. When we saw him, he was retired. Very hard thing for a man to go back on all of his lifelong beliefs. And so he said as follows to us. He said, I used to believe in socialism. I still do. But socialism is an ideal. We can't have it in the real world, he said, until we're rich enough to be able to afford it. And he said, socialism will be practical when every man in Poland has a house and 2 servants. And I said to him, including the servants? And he said, yes. Now,
there's a little bit of Milton Friedman for you, Dr. Marv Treiger, telling a story of an exchange with Edward Lipinski, a socialist from Poland. What do you make of that? I think that was a pretty apt point.
Well, dear Mr. Lipinski, is that his name, Lipinski?
Yes.
Well, he had not sufficiently taken that roto-rooter to his brain. That was the problem with him. That's a perfect example of just how this thing, as I was talking about earlier, how this thing works. Yes, it's not practical. Socialism is not practical. But yes, I still support socialism because it's a beautiful ideal, and it'll happen when the following. And Marx made the case that socialism could only come when the most advanced capitalist countries went over to socialism. It couldn't happen in a third world country because you needed a certain level of prosperity to reach socialism. And of course, that never unfolded or took place, and the working class wanted to move up to the middle class. They didn't want to overthrow the government. And so all of these things were utopian, but Lipchinsky is still hanging on to bits and pieces of the Marxist outlook, even though there he is in Poland. My God.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Marv, where sometimes what we see is a situation where people do say, well, ideally we would have a socialist society, but it can't work, so let's not go to it. I'm with you. Even in an ideal world, socialism is still not the way to go, still horrific, still a violation fundamentally of individual rights and the ideal. The ideal is a small and limited government with a maximally capitalist system, in my view. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.